Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Pam and Whisper with another story for you today. Today we're going to do things a little bit differently. If you have a piece of paper and some crayons or markers, I'd like you to pull those out because this story is going to be done a little differently than our other stories. Today we're reading the book, Two Bad Ants. You'll notice there's no picture on the cover. And I'm not going to show you the pictures right away either. I'm going to ask you to use your imagination and try to picture what I'm reading about. And then after you've guessed, I'll show you the picture. It will make more sense once we get started. Why don't you pause the camera for a minute, or the TV, whatever you're watching this on, not a camera, and get your piece of paper and your crayons or markers so you can draw what's happening in the story. I'll wait here just a minute while you do that. Okay, so our story is called Two Bad Ants. The news traveled swiftly through the tunnels of the ant world. A scout had returned with a remarkable discovery. A beautiful, sparkling crystal. When the scout presented the crystal to the ant queen, she took a small bite, then quickly ate the entire thing. She deemed it the most delicious food she had ever tasted. Nothing could make her happier than to have more, much more. The ants understood. They were eager to gather more crystals because the queen was the mother of them all. Her happiness made the whole ant nest a happy place. I want you to think for a minute. What would be a crystal for an ant? Think about how tiny an ant is. So this crystal that the ants are carrying back to the ant queen has to be really small. And then remember, she took a bite of it. What do you think that crystal is? I'll show you. The crystal is a piece of sugar. Can you see that? One tiny little grain of sugar is like a big crystal to an ant. It was late in the day when they departed. Long shadows stretched over the entrance to the ant kingdom. One by one, the insects climbed out, following the scout who had made it clear there were many crystals where the first had been found, but the journey was long and dangerous. They marched into the woods that surrounded their underground home. Dusk turned to twilight, twilight to night. The path they followed twisted and turned, every bend leading them deeper into the dark forest. Now, if you think this forest is like a forest that you and I would go in, you are mistaken. Think about it. What would seem like a forest to ants? Those aren't trees the ants are walking through. What are those? If you said blades of grass, you're correct. They're basically walking through a yard. But to ants, that would seem like a forest. More than once, the line of ants stopped and listened anxiously for the sounds of hungry spiders. But all they heard was the call of crickets echoing through the woods like distant thunder. Crickets don't sound like thunder to me, but I'm big. To an ant, a little teeny tiny ant, I bet cricket sounds would sound like thunder. Dew formed on the leaves above. Without warning, huge cold drops fell on the marching ants. A firefly passed overhead that, for an instant, lit up the woods with a blinding flash of blue-green light. you can see a flash of light in the corner of one of the pages where the firefly is lighting up their world. At the edge of the forest stood a mountain. The ants looked up and could not see its peak, for it seemed to reach right to the heavens. But they did not stop. Up the side they climbed, higher and higher. The wind whistled through the cracks of the mountain's face. The ants could feel its force bending their delicate antennae. Their legs grew weak as they struggled upward. At last they reached a ledge and crawled through a narrow tunnel. Now, the forest that the ants went through wasn't a forest, it was a yard. Do you have a guess as to what the mountain might be? Take a look. Can you see what they're climbing up? It might look like a wall, but there's something else that's also made of brick that might seem like a mountain to an ant. Something like a house, maybe? When the ants came out of the tunnel, they found themselves in a strange world. Smells they had known all their lives, smells of dirt and grass and rotting plants, had vanished. There was no more wind, and most puzzling of all, it seemed that the sky was gone. They crossed smooth, shiny surfaces, then followed the scout up a glassy curved wall. They had reached their goal. From the top of the wall they looked below to a sea of crystals. One by one, the ants climbed down into the sparkling treasure. The next picture is not going to be a picture of the sparkling treasure yet, but it's a picture of where the ants were when they left the tunnel. What does that look like to you? If you said a kitchen counter, you are correct. That's why there's no sky and no wind, and it smells differently. They're now inside the house. Quickly, they each chose a crystal, then turned to start the journey home. There was something about this unnatural place that made the ants nervous. In fact, they left in such a hurry that none of them noticed the two small ants who stayed behind. "Why go back?" one asked the other. "This place may not feel like home, but look at all these crystals." "You're right," said the other. "We can stay here and eat this tasty treasure for every day, forever." So the two ants ate crystal after crystal until they were too full to move and fell asleep. Now you can see the sugar bowl that the ants climbed into and all of the crystals. And you can also see the two bad ants who stayed behind. Daylight came. The sleeping ants were unaware of changes taking place in their newfound home. A giant silver scoop hovered above them, then plunged deep into the crystals. It shoveled up both ants and crystals and carried them high into the air. The ants were wide awake when the scoop turned, dropping them from a frightening height. They tumbled through space in a shower of crystals and fell into a boiling brown lake. What do you think the giant silver scoop might be? Can you tell? Only part of it shows in this picture. If you said a spoon, you were correct. boiling brown lake. That picture comes next. Hang on. Then the giant scoop stirred violently back and forth. Crushing waves fell over the ants. They paddled hard to keep their tiny heads above water, but the scoop kept spinning the hot brown liquid. Round and round it went, creating a whirlpool that sucked the ants deeper and deeper. They both held their breath and finally bobbed to the surface, gasping for air and spitting mouthfuls of the terrible, bitter water. Except it's not water, is it? It's hot coffee. Those ants were lucky they weren't burned to death. There you see the spoon stirring around and the ants barely keeping alive. Then the lake tilted and began to empty into a cave. The ants could hear the rushing water and felt themselves pulled toward the pitch-black hole. Suddenly the cave disappeared, and the lake became calm. The ants swam to the shore and found that the lake had steep sides. They hurried down the walls that held back the lake. The frightened insects looked for a place to hide, worried that the giant scoop might shovel them up again. Close by, they found a huge round disc with holes that could neatly hide them. All right, let's think about that cave. What do you think that cave could be? If you said it was a mouth, you were correct. It's a good thing those ants weren't swallowed alive. And now they've crawled out of the cup. And they're in a disc with holes. Any ideas what that might be? But as soon as they had climbed inside, their hiding place was lifted, tilted, and lowered into a dark space. When the ants climbed out of the holes, they were surrounded by a strange red glow. It seemed to them that every second the temperature was rising. It soon became so unbearably hot that they thought they would soon be cooked, but suddenly the disc they were standing on rocketed upward, and the two hot ants went flying through the air. Any ideas? The disc with holes was an English muffin, and when they were lifted, tilted, and lowered into a dark space, that space was a toaster. And then, once the English muffins were heated up enough, they popped up out of the toaster along with the ants. They landed near what seemed to be a fountain, a waterfall pouring from a silver tube. Both ants had a powerful thirst and longed to dip their feverish heads into the refreshing water. They quickly climbed along the tube. As they got closer to the rushing water, the ants felt a cool spray. They tightly gripped the shiny surface of the fountain and slowly leaned their heads into the falling stream. But the force of the water was much too strong. Can you think of what that fountain might be? If you said the kitchen faucet, you were right. The tiny insects were pulled off the fountain and plunged down into a wet, dark chamber. They landed on half-eaten fruit and other soggy things. Suddenly, the air was filled with loud, frightening sounds. The chamber began to spin. The ants were caught in a whirling storm of shredded food and stinging rain. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise and spinning stopped. Bruised and dizzy, the ants climbed out of the chamber, which just happened to be, did you guess? A dish disposal. I don't have one at my house. Maybe you do. In daylight, once again, they raced through puddles and up a smooth metal wall. In the distance, they saw something comforting. 2 long, narrow holes that reminded them of the warmth and safety of their old underground home. They climbed up into the dark openings, but there was no safety inside these holes. A strange force passed through the wet ants. They were stunned senseless and blown out of the holes like bullets from a gun. When they landed, the tiny insects were too exhausted to go on. They crawled into a dark corner and fell fast asleep. Now, what these 2 ants did is something that's very dangerous for humans. It could kill you. So I hope that you will be smarter than these ants. Look where they went. They went right into the electrical outlet, and they were blown out by the force of the electricity, the same force that could kill a child. Don't ever be like those 2 bad ants. Night had returned when the battered ants awoke to a familiar sound. The footsteps of their fellow insects returning for more crystals. The 2 ants slipped quietly to the end of the line. They climbed the glassy wall and once again stood amid the treasure. But this time, they each chose a single crystal and followed their friends home. Standing at the edge of their ant hole, the 2 ants listened to the joyful sounds that came from below. They knew how grateful their mother queen would be when they gave her the crystals. At that moment, the 2 ants felt happier than they'd ever felt before. This was their home. This was their family. This was where they were meant to be. I think those ants learned their lesson, don't you? I would love to see some of the pictures that you drew of the 2 bad ants. Save them, and when we go back to church and meet at recast, bring your picture along because I'd really like to see it. That's all for now. Whisper and I want to say goodbye and stay safe. And don't be like the 2 bad ants. Do what you're supposed to do. Stay out of trouble. See you next week.